Hey guys, Pete here. This will be part 2 of my Westworld Season 1 Episode 3 recap and review. This video will be the summary for Episode 3 with analysis of some of the storylines, some questions that came up, and some popular theories about the show. Some of the theory is mine, and I also look at some of the other popular theories that have been kicking around. If you haven't seen the first part of the recap, I'll put a link right up at the top here. If you click on that, you can check out my scene-by-scene breakdown that I put out yesterday. As a warning, this video will contain spoilers for everything that has happened in Westworld up to this point. With that out of the way, let's get right on it. So to summarize, in episode 3, we got a lot of new information about the park's origin story and about how the hosts are programmed to think. Some of what we learned is pretty straightforward, but other events don't do much as far as clearing up what's going on. In the first episode, we saw Dolores kill the fly, which was an indication that she had evolved to a different level than the other hosts. It wasn't completely clear if she was lying to Stubbs and Bernard when they were interviewing her, but it was a definite possibility. In this episode, we find out for sure that Bernard is using her as an experiment, but I also think that Ford is making changes to her at the same time. She exhibits behavior that's outside her normal narrative. She asked Teddy to leave with her, and that falls right into the changes we saw Ford make with him when he gave him his backstory. We didn't get a scene with Dolores and Ford, but there isn't strong evidence that Bernard not rolling her back would lead her right into Ford's new storyline either. So I'm left wondering if some of the changes we see with her are normal from an updated narrative, and then others like her improvising with Bernard at the end are related specifically to what he's doing with her. He stresses that she shouldn't tell anybody about what they're talking about, and we assume that she doesn't do that. On the other hand though, if he can tell her not to tell anyone, why wouldn't Ford be able to override that decision? We're gonna have to wait and see what happens with her before we know what either one of them is actually up to. The new storyline that Ford is putting together seems pretty badass. We learned that he is pulling a huge amount of resources, and we learned that poor Teddy never had a backstory. The one he got is kind of crazy, and its main character Wyatt resembles what Ford told us about Arnold's bicameral mind idea. Teddy says that Wyatt thought he could hear the voice of God, which is something that could happen in the consciousness experiment to the hosts if it made them crazy. Ford did say to Teddy that, like all good fiction, the backstory has a bit of truth to it, but is that as far as it goes? I mean, did he really just decide to use this on the same day that they find out that this guy exists, or are they somehow related? Whether or not that's the case, why did Wyatt's men seem to be invincible? I don't think that's been answered at this point, and I don't think the reason behind the Stray taking off is all that clear either. If Ford just started adding this into the narrative, would he really have planned it in a way that some hosts would just sneak off and join Wyatt in the hills? That it would actually be the ones who have weapons privileges specifically? And would he have made it so that they couldn't be killed for some reason? None of that really makes sense yet, and it doesn't seem likely that anyone other than Ford knows what he's planning. Teresa did say that he was using a lot of resources that were causing problems for other storylines, but I would think she would have been specific if the host had been straying off. I just assumed that he was taking up a bunch of land that was infringing on areas that other things took place. The existence of Arnold is the big reveal of episode 3 in my opinion, but it is a reveal that asks more questions than it actually answers. A couple of big questions are whether did he really die? And why are the hosts that are going off script talking to him if that's the case? If he's still alive, how is he able to influence things, and does Ford already know about it? I mean, Ford could be launching this new narrative as a way to get at him, or is it just a matter of the old code popping up to remind him of that story? The Stray is obviously important. I think, based on what other information we got about how hosts make decisions, it's odd that he bashes his own brains in. It's like he didn't want to leave any evidence behind of what was going on with him. That could, hint at self-interest, that he abandoned his loop to take off in his own direction. We know that he wasn't programmed to have any interest in stars, but he was carving constellations into his carvings. Hopefully in the next episode we'll find out more about what set him off on his path, because like I said, it's almost like he was protecting a secret by bashing his own head in. That's not something that he should have done. After writing these last few paragraphs down and then thinking about it later, I'm starting to wonder about the changes we see in Dr. Ford in this episode. To this point in the story, we've had the idea that all he's really interested in is the evolution of the host that he's created. There are quite a few examples of this, but what stands out in my mind the most is when he was talking with Bernard about evolution. He says that people are done, since they've evolved to the point of being able to keep even the sickest amongst them alive. This planted a seed for me that he wasn't concerned about the problems after the reveries because at least things were moving along in their development. The whole speech about mistakes being responsible for sentient life led me to think that he has real interest in the host's evolution. In episode 3, however, he does a complete 180 and is anxious to tell Bernard about how the hosts aren't more than they seem every time he gets a chance. The hosts who went off the rails after his update are starting to remember things, something he says they shouldn't be able to do. They're also talking about Arnold, who no one in programming had ever heard of before, and he's someone who was essential in developing the technology they work with every day. Also, Lee Sizemore said that Ford hadn't been involved in the storylines for years, and nothing about him has shown he cares about the corporate side of, the park. He decided to step in and take over with this idea, so what was his motivation? He just had an urge to get back in the saddle, or does he think that his new idea will be able to redefine the guest experience? I mean, for how the park works in its present state, the idea Lee had seems like it would have been entertaining enough. But Ford gave a speech saying that people come to the park for a glimpse of who they could be because they already know who they are. All of this makes me think that everything that's happening in Westworld might be tied into this new storyline. Maybe some things weren't exactly planned, but I think he started implementing the idea before his big speech after Lee's presentation. We saw that he was spending time out in the deserted area of the park, which means we know he's been planning it for a while. So that just leaves the question of why is it so special? And when did he start to put things into motion? Could the idea of Arnold just be part of the narrative? Could he be keeping the staff in the dark for reasons that will make his storyline more effective when things start to happen? I think a strange change of behavior is enough to consider it. I mean, the Arnold twist will be good either way, but let me know what you guys think. Do you think he's a real person and the story Ford tells Bernard is actually the real story? Or do you think he was added as a part of the new narrative? If you don't have an opinion, which story, which one are you going to root for? I just think there's a little bit too much in the way of, similarities between Arnold and then Wyatt for it to be completely coincidence that both of these characters came into the forefront right at this time. Also, let me know if you think the host we saw in the flashbacks is Dolores. I've heard people say Armistice as well, so let me know if you think that is a better candidate. We know Dolores is the oldest host in the park, and we heard Stubbs tell the tech that she's been repaired so many times that she's practically brand new. We also saw Peter Abernathy in the flashback, and he looked pretty much the same other than his clothes, but it's interesting to wonder because they showed that host a couple times. It'll be interesting to see how things develop with Dolores, as it looks like Bernard has set her on a path to achieve consciousness. I guess the theorists will say that Bernard is a host and is just acting according to how he was programmed by Ford. Like I mentioned, I'm not there yet, but let me know what you guys think about that theory in the comments. There were a couple parts of this episode that made Bernard seem like he may not be a human. Another big theory that was going around seems to be debunked by the events in this episode. There was one going around that the man in black was actually William, whose story was taking place on a different timeline. Basically, that William's story was taking place 30 years before the other stuff that's going on. But after seeing what the park looked like in the beginning, it doesn't really look like that's the case. They don't, it didn't look the same back then. Also, even though Elsie and Bernard don't show up in any scenes with him, it seems like with Dolores showing up at the end hints that all of what's going on is happening in the same timeline, in the present time. That is to say that she ran off into the night because of the changes she's experiencing, and it looks like she ran into William right after that. The major thing I was left wondering is, what is the man in black up to with Dolores? When we saw him take her to the barn in the first episode, the impression was that he was going to force himself on her. His comment about wanting her to fight since he paid so much money was pretty good evidence. Now that we've seen her remember the scene, new questions pop up. For context, when he first came, he mentioned her still not remembering him. He then started dragging her off, but had to stop and kill Teddy along the way. The last thing we saw was him closing the door. In her memories, we see that he says, "Let's start from the beginning," and then pulls out a knife. If you think about it, he wouldn't need a knife to rape or terrify her. We saw him overpower her easily in the yard, and she's clearly terrified already. So was he planning on scalping her? This could make sense, but we see him take the dealer's scalp with him after he takes his, and when they are interviewing Dolores for the first first time, she still has that blood on her cheek that we see came from her father in the very same scene. If he isn't raping her or scalping her, what exactly does he do with her in the barn? And why is this the memory out of thousands of times through this narrative that she holds on to? We know she is the original host, so it makes sense that he would have a history with her after visiting for 30 years. But it's hard to guess what he's actually, looking for from her. Either way, whatever he did to her was bad enough that she was able to override her programming to evolve into something else when she remembered it. Even though we don't see him take her scalp, the maze he found on the dealers might be related. If Arnold has something to do with the hosts that are showing the strange behaviors, then hosts that have been around since he was building them might be important to the Man in Black. We see him pick the dealer out specifically to take him out into the desert. He then leaves the minimum amount of blood he can survive on inside of him and tells him that he wants answers. After that, we see him riding away with a scalp that has a maze with a man in the center of it. This makes you wonder if Arnold is the man in the middle of the maze, or if he designed the maze as a sort of test for consciousness. That is, like, if a host can figure out what the maze is and can find their way through it, then that could prove that they were a conscious being, which could be what the man in the middle of the maze represents. We've already seen we're going to learn more about the maze in the previews for the next episode, so we'll hold on making any crazy assumptions. It was another good episode, even if we were left with a bunch of questions. I think the pacing is good, the look of the world still gets to me, and the acting is super top notch. Also, the effects in the eyeball scene were pretty amazingly real. I like the introduction of Arnold to the story, and I like the interactions with Bernard and Dolores. I think that there's going to be some interesting stuff that's going to come out of that relationship based on the fact that his son's death has such a big effect on his life. I'm excited to see what Ford is planning with the new story and hoping to get more info about what the Man in Black and the maze are really about, since we didn't see much of him in this actual episode. Let me know what you guys think about it though, and leave any questions you have in the comments. I'd definitely consider doing a Q&A video in between episode videos if people start leaving more questions about things that I didn't go over. I mean, this is like a 5,600 word document that I'm reading right now, and I know I left a bunch of stuff out, so just leave questions if you have them, and if there's a bunch, I'll make a Q&A video in between before the next episode comes out. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe to my channel before you go. Thanks for watching. I will talk to you soon.